I did the sadness repression and inside out path video, and it didn't feel right to me because basically there's a couple reasons. One is the main reason is that I rushed through it. Someone asked me to condense the material. This path is hard, or I am hard. It is hard for me to condense this subject, or this subject is hard to condense. But I'm also aware that I'm not aware of how this work is perceived and received by people because everybody's different. Everybody has a different paradigm and a different nervous system and different primary repression and their own different dimensions of practice. People are different. So, I'm just listening to you all. Recently, I've been listening a lot, even to my trainers. And some people have said that, like, sometimes the pace that I go, people can't keep up with that because they haven't done the repression work. So I can talk at a fast pace about something that feels, natural to me. And like I know the subject intuitively, but then that or somehow it just doesn't go at a pace that somebody else can follow, you know? And I've been told that a few times. Um, yeah, so I'm just learning how to how to introduce the material and the context in a way that's digestible. But I was just going too fast though, trying to condense that material because I'm just under trying to listening to your feedback. It's what it was. It's the first version of the sadness repression video was longer. And then someone said, "Can you condense that?" I should have just said no. But again, I'm trying to be more aware of how I'm not aware of how the work is being received and perceived. So I just need to just do it the way that I do it. And later on, I think this work will be put into digestible parts. That's what we do in training. Is we have these awesome trainers, and they go and they take my when I come up with something and I share about it, they'll take the basic stuff and then create modules to train people in it. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen here. Is that I think about doing this, like I could do a video for everything. I could um, love repression and the inside out path. That's a whole topic in and of itself. You can repress anything that can arise can be repressed. So you could do a video on each of those topics. Excuse me. Well, I'm obviously not going to do that. But what I'm going to do is just, first of all, I just want to dedicate this video to my partner, Chester, no matter where we may be as time unfolds. We're together now. And his primary repression is sadness, hurt. And this is not my direct experience with sadness as a primary. I don't know exactly how that unfolded for me because I wasn't thinking about repression earlier on in my path, but I just know that I did a lot, a lot of processing around feelings of sadness, woundedness, hurt, grief, connected to, well, what I call my deficiency story. I'm unlovable. So I think I either not much of a sadness or hurt repressor, or I did that work already. Because by the time the chronic pain came, there just wasn't much evidence of sadness or grief repression. The reason I say that is because it's funny that I'm having a bit of a struggle sharing on sadness repression. You know what that shows you, quite honestly, is that I'm always sharing from my experience. That actually is what that shows you. I'm actually struggling a little bit with sadness repression. This is the third video. Okay, but why I'm struggling is that it's not that I'm struggling with the topic of repression because I feel like I know it like the back of my hand. Like this subject of trauma and repression is something that I feel like I know very intimately now. But sadness repression is strangely, it's more of a shadow for me, or not a shadow, sort of the way that they define shadow is well, as an anger repressor, I've drawn to sadness repressors. Those archetypes are often drawn to each other. I want to talk about that. It's fascinating, actually. And once you tune into it, the fact that all over the earth, anger and anger repressors and sadness repressors are in relationships of all kinds, but especially romantic relationships, because we're shadows of each other. We're both positively drawn to each other in many cases and triggered by each other. And by the way, you know what I mean. I mean, you've had probably these relationships where there's a very strong attraction and there's a shadow and trauma. And you might not have been able to name it before KI or name it this way, but like I say, it's like a double shadow. Fascinating topic, and that's where I want to go with KI. And you're probably going to see those videos. I'm just going to touch upon it today. You're going to see those videos later. Okay, dedicating this video to Chester because I'm in that relationship and sadness is not my primary. And I want to take my time and dedicate this to my husband, ex-husband, and just sit with me, please. The recommendation for me to rush is what created part of the havoc. I need to be able to sit because I actually feel I have a lot of compassion. And that video that I just released on sadness repression didn't convey it because I was trying to rush through the material, learning, don't do that, because there's a certain amount of heart that needs to be conveyed here that is very real emotion for me and passion around this subject. And the earlier versions of this video had that, and then the rush one didn't. Okay, so what I'm saying is perhaps maybe I'll just weed out the people who want me to who want me to condense the message because I don't think they're going to make it here. I don't think I'm going to make it doing short videos. So sit with me, and if you can't do that right now without distractions, just do it later. Sit and just take it all in. Watch this video at least once because if you're a sadness or hurt repressor, I think this is really, really going to be helpful if you're on the KI path. Okay, where shall we start here? I'm not going to do experiential work. So when I explain inquiries today, I'm not asking you to follow along. See, I've already done that. I've already showed you how to do that. There's plenty of videos for that. This is just for the context. What is the context and the practices? What are they for somebody with sadness or grief or hurt as a primary repression on this inside out path? Yes, we have new terms. We've had to create new terms because it's a new path. People might be wondering, what are those words you just said? Yeah, because those are words. All words are pointers. So those words point to something that's relevant for all of us on the KI path. This is how we talk. Um, yeah, let me just start with my compassion for sadness repressors, because as far as I can tell, and many of you are can be misunderstood, especially in the spiritual world. Meaning, see, if you repress sadness, grief, or hurt primarily as a vulnerable emotion, so that's what feels not safe, are the more vulnerable emotions, often for a sadness repressor. They didn't feel like they could open up when they were kids to that emotion or those emotions. No matter what happened, they didn't feel like they could feel or express that. So they got shut down around it and they stored sadness, grief, or hurt the way that I had stored anger. And I also stored some hurt, of course, because I was bullied. These emotions don't happen in isolation from each other. So some people have come through KI and very innocently have almost tried to disqualify themselves from the primary repression conversation because they'll say, I repress all emotions. Well, it can look like that in the beginning, And you probably do. If that's your experience, if you've tested that out, then that's probably true. But as you dig deeper, what you find is that to say that all emotions are repressed equally probably doesn't gel with your actual experience, that something is just equal across the board, because we're human beings. There's a diversity to our experience, and we come from families that are complex. And so when you dig deeper, you might, of course, many of your emotions may have had to be shut down, had to been shut down to stay safe and survive. But if you dig deeper, you may find that one or more emotions is more suppressed or repressed than others. So just keep an open mind. But even if you continue to think that all of the emotions are equally repressed, then the word primary repression is pointing to that. So primary repression is not pointing to one emotion. The reason that I titled these videos like anger repression in the inside out path, sadness repression in the inside out path, or even that I use the word primary repression is just for this reason. The word primary repression points to whatever you avoid, period. It's that simple. Primary repression points to whatever you avoid primarily. It could be anger, it could be anger, hurt. It could be, it's fear for all of us. I'll explain that on another day or later. Frozen fear is part of all of our experience when we have repression because we're afraid to feel and express sadness. We're afraid to feel and express anger. So that fear is also layered in the body with the sadness or with the anger. So right there, none of us really have just one emotion. Even if I'm an anger repressor, if I just have, I don't just have anger stored in my body, I would have at least fear of feeling and expressing anger. The fear, the actual emotion would be stored in my body also. But the truth of the matter is it's not even like that. It's that if you're an anger repressor, you're likely to find hurt and sadness or grief buried in with the anger and fear and shame and all of that because these emotions don't exist really totally independently. They don't exist independently, but they are different. They're different flavors, different quality, right? So primary repression, that word is simply pointing to whatever you avoid. So I avoided and I stuffed down femininity. That's not really an emotion, see? But I was afraid to express that in myself. So the frozen fear was in my body. The anger repression had fear with it. I was afraid to express anger, and that's all stored in the chronic pain. There was also hurt that I couldn't even access without doing the anger repression because the hurt was layered in with the repression of anger. So I found a smorgasbord of emotions, but anger was primary. Now, sadness repressors, if that's your primary, it wouldn't be like that. It would be, yeah, there would be anger, but primarily it would be sadness, grief, or hurt that didn't feel safe. So that's what's going to be stored mostly in the contraction or the chronic pain or whatever. And then you're going to also find frozen fear when you go. So it would be like you're doing KI. I'm not hurt. I'm not sad. And you feel it. Yes, I am. But it's like stuck or like really repressed. Maybe it's pain or contraction. But then you also hear like, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to feel and express that. I can't. So there's, it's all layered in together. And then also let me say, the video that I just did on sadness repression, I called it sadness repression through the whole video. That's one of the main reasons I'm doing the video again, because it really isn't like that. First of all, a lot of sadness repressors relate more to the word hurt, especially during inquiry. So if they go into their inner body and they say, I'm not sad, when they're looking at mom and dad, for example, they'll probably feel it like it's, well, they're shut down around it. So they wouldn't feel sadness at first. If you're a sadness repressor primarily, and you go back to mom and dad and you say, I'm not sad, you're most likely going to feel the contraction, the frozen emotion. So it would feel like contraction, pain, or just it's like a body response, but it's not sadness. It's, dark matter or the programming of repression in the body. But if they turn and they say, I'm not hurt, it's like so often the sadness repressor will say, yeah, that resonates more. I'm hurt by them, that word. And so it's more like a family of emotions or different words that you're gonna have to play around with to see words do matter at the level of the somatic with repression. Because again, if you don't name it, if it's sadness, it doesn't get pulled into awareness. If you don't name it, because it's mind and body with repression, if you don't name it and know what it is, it doesn't come into awareness. That's the whole problem with the non-dual Eastern practices right there, is because with repressed and suppressed emotions, people are not naming them. They're just resting as awareness and like meditation or whatever else. And the unnamed emotion remains unnamed. So the mind that has suppressed it remains unconscious. By just not naming it, the unconsciousness remains and the energy stays stored in the body. Once you name it and you start to do KI, you're awake to the mind body connection. I'm hurt starts to become, you're aware of that. And I can't express hurt. Those are thoughts that are going to start coming into awareness with KI. And then with that, there's going to be energy with those thoughts. That's going to be the repression. So fundamentally, you could say there's a couple of inquiries that I'm saying that I suggest that sadness repressors, it's like I just want carry these like a muse, as I've been saying. These particular inquiries are gold for a sadness repressor or hurt. Because a lot of it deals with abandonment, not always, but like it's not just I said in the last video, because this is Chester's experience. That's why I shared that. But human experience is so diverse. So I have to expand this beyond what Chester had, the kind of the classic example of it, though. If I could just share, he's given me permission to share some of this. So helpful, actually. His biological mother left at a very early age, just left. So, like a physical abandonment, which was in and of itself traumatic. And then his stepmother just wasn't really there, abandoned him emotionally, was not there. And I think a lot of people experience that kind of abandonment or that kind of trauma, which is more developmental trauma, where you're with a parent, they're not giving you the love or the attention that you need, the acceptance, whatever that is. And it's like they're not present. And for what your needs aren't being met is the issue, period. And so that is traumatizing. So he had both kinds of trauma or abandonment. Therefore, and then he lived in a family in which his father, it did not provide a safe atmosphere for the expression of hurt or sadness. You could get angry in the household. That's manly. But you can't really show hurt, or that's the message that was sent. So Chester, his system grew up repressing hurt and sadness. He also grew up gay. So he was bullied and then had to deal with all that. But he fought back probably much more in anger than I did because he didn't repress anger. And in his household, he fought back with anger because anger was allowed in his household. But then he stored the hurt and sadness. So many of you will have something like that, but not those facts. Something that where it just felt like you could never really open to that emotion, and that emotion is an important part of your childhood, like something happened. It's very hurtful, but you couldn't open to it. So, it could be any set of facts, but look for that, whatever happened. And then you want to know from the beginning. So that's the inside out path, is to learn from the beginning. It's so valuable. I can't begin to tell you how changes started to happen once I named my repression. My primary repression is anger. The changes just started to happen quite naturally because I started to focus in the right area. I'd spent my whole life avoiding that emotion. So that avoidance was the root of suffering. right? Repression, as we know now from the science, is a major contributing factor to disease, mental health issues, chronic pain, and then we're seeing it in spirituality and body contraction. It produces shadows. We're learning in KI, and I think that they would say most, I would think really good child development researchers would, I would imagine they would have to agree with this, that um well, you would have to, I don't know, I had to do experiential work to recognize this. I don't know that researchers would have found this. I would love to hear from anybody watching right now. Can you help me out? I know there's only like 1,000 or so viewers per video, but of the 1,000 of you, do you know anybody out there who's saying that the sense of deficiency or lack, that identity that we have as part of the ego, that it comes directly from I can't be myself as a kid. So I can't feel and express sadness as a kid. So I develop a false self because I can't be my authentic self. Now, I know that the child development researchers talk about the development of that, but can you send anything where they've connected it directly to repression? Because we've connected it, we see it. And yeah, that's all I can tell you. You'll see it in inquiry, you'll see it in direct experience. Basically, how I started seeing it was when I started doing repression work for people, we weren't focusing on the deficiency story really. But they would report back that they were just getting triggered less on the deficiency story or that it was kind of going away. And just, oh, that's what that is. Because I was telling you for years, focusing on the deficiency story, which so many Eastern practices focus on identity like that, it just wasn't getting to it for people. That, in other words, the sense that I'm not good enough, the deficiency or the lack would continue because primarily it's a somatic experience. It's a felt sense that there's something wrong with me. I'm lacking something. Whether it's I'm not good enough or I'm unlovable or whatever it is, that's the mind part of it. But in the body, it's the felt sense that something is wrong. And when you get triggered, it gets strong, and you can even get upset from it because, like if you came from a childhood in which anger was safer than sadness, when you get into some sort of trigger, the anger might come out. If you're a sadness repressor, for example, if anger is not also repressed, that's how you might experience a trigger. So many of you who are sadness repressors, when you get triggered by your spouse or something, I want you to notice some of you get angrier than others, or even angrier than your spouse, especially if your spouse represses anger. And so that's your deficiency story. Not that you don't have feelings of woundedness and sadness, but if that's your primary repression, when you're triggered, your system might very easily produce anger and upset. Obviously, rather than the primary repression, you're protected. You're protected at every trigger from having to really feel and or express hurt or sadness, and your system is protecting you. It's doing it automatically, immediately, and unconsciously. So, for example, if it's an unconscious thing, so if you're triggered by something, immediately the hurt and sadness is held back. And then what's left would be, right, the deficiency story, the identity, and then whatever other emotions, which are not primarily repressed. So again, anger could be fear. You could even be dissociating or disconnecting in a trigger. There's different responses. It's not just an emotion. Sometimes it doesn't even feel safe to express anything. And so you just shut down, or we start coming from the mind in a dispute with somebody that we love, psychoanalyzing or analyzing when we're actually really deeply hurt. We can't open to it. So just understanding from the beginning of the inside out path, the relationship between the deficiency story or the sense of lack that we carry around with us pretty constantly, but that also really gets triggered in a dispute, that is connected directly to the repression. I can't feel and express my true self, my authentic emotions, sadness or hurt, therefore false self. But even when we're triggered, as a sadness repressor is triggered, it's like an anger repressor. The repression mechanism doesn't arise. It's just producing whatever. But the crazy thing about it is that the deficiency story identity itself is rather unconscious and triggers. So I woke up to awareness and still couldn't see the deficiency story in a trigger. So, and also the teachings were just saying rest and allow whatever's there. Well, that also hid it from me because, as the trauma research says, the memory, when you're triggered presently, the memory or memories from which the trigger comes, the trauma doesn't arise. So if earlier in your life through trauma, you developed this deficiency story as part of that self protective ego, then that's not going to arise. And for many of us, it doesn't in a trigger. What does that mean? It just means we're not actually specifically conscious of it. So wife says something, we're not immediately aware, oh, I'm not good enough. Now, some of us have been doing spiritual work, we are more conscious of it. So that wouldn't be your experience there. But earlier, and when you first got to spiritual work, you probably, when you were triggered, weren't that conscious of the identity there. The boomerang that we have is a tool that we use to illuminate that. And that's what I'm encouraging people to do in every trigger is start with a boomerang when you're a sadness repressor and just say, okay, what deficiency story is coming up for me? What does this bring up for me? Feel into the inner body. So just write down, because I'm not really taking you through it, but write down when I'm triggered as a sadness repressor, boomerang first. Just write it down. Because I'm not, if I were to sit and take you through all these inquiries, this video would be 3 hours long. So boomerang first. Name the deficiency story, because by naming it, Jack Cornfield, I just heard him say something about naming unconscious stuff, and I totally agree. Name the identity so that it's not unconscious anymore. Because see, you're following your body, you're not making something up. You're actually making something conscious that's already here, but hidden in the body. So when you're triggered, remember the trauma research says it's not going to arise, the source of the trigger, but yet the reaction will be there. That's what they're saying. Trauma doesn't arise as a memory, it arises as a reaction. So when you're triggered, the reaction is there. Stop, do the boomerang in the reaction. Obviously, sometimes you just have to react. We're still going to get into disputes and conflict, but we're talking about processing. When you're able to pull away, pull the person up, what deficiency story comes up for me here? You want to feel into the inner body. That's where the repression is. The felt sense in the trigger is the repression. It's the felt sense of lack. But you go ahead and name it as an identity first. That lack is the repression. That's what I'm going to show you. But name the identity first. So I'm triggered. I feel it in my body. I'm unlovable. That's what I am. Good. So you've named it. Now you want to go back to your VIPs there and pull up mom, dad, important people from the past. You want to feel into the energy that just got stirred up there, just to double check. Is this feeling of unlovability that I'm feeling here in this trigger, is this something from the past, from the trauma of my family? Looking at the VIPs of your family, you just say the opposite. Say, I'm totally lovable. Just for the purpose of seeing if the same energy that got triggered is this energy with mom and dad. And you're most likely going to find yes. It's like the body's going to, it's going to disagree when you say I'm lovable as a reverse inquiry. And then I want you to go, as a sadness repressor, go straight into I'm not hurt by them. And stay awake to the mind-body connection. Also, another inquiry for sadness repressors when you get here would be, I can express the hurt. These are two inquiries you're going to be with for a while. They open you up to the repression. And By the way, some of you will shut down when you get to that repression. And everything that happens when you get to the repression teaches us on the inside out path. So you just want to pay attention to whatever happens for you when you go through that exercise and a trigger. I'll explain the different things that can happen there. But what happens right there when you're inquiring on the primary repression is everything. And KI is literally everything for the deeper, deeper healing and freedom. Let me explain. This is what I just didn't take time with the other day. And this really needs time or space to just sit with this and hear it all. One big reason that I wanted to do the video again is because living with Chester for 5 years, or being with him, he needs help just like all of us when he's triggered. You can't rush through this. I mean, you can, but you miss it. We really need to slow it down and just first think about what's happening and then apply it into our lives. So yeah, I mean, I was just thinking a video, the way that I did that would not have really helped Chester because you really need somebody to slow things down. So that's what I'm doing here. When you get to the primary repression, that's what I'm calling that. When you say, I'm not hurt, and you're with every thought that comes up that says, I am hurt. Here's the thing. A lot of you will experience that the thoughts don't even come up or just barely. So like you'll say, I'm not hurt. And it'll be like, it's like a felt sense of, yes, I am. But it won't even feel like hurt or sadness. That's the crazy thing. And that's why you can't rush through something like this, because if we do, we just might miss it. We might go, I'm not hurt. And because the hurt or sadness has concretized and frozen into a contraction or dark matter, we might miss it because there's no emotion really there, or just very little, not knowing that it's repression or not really putting two and two together. And there's the bypass, right? So we want to remember that first, if you're a sadness repressor or hurt repressor, when you get to the primary repression like that, remember, don't look for hurt or sadness. You might actually find anger because that's not as repressed, some of you, and that might mislead you into thinking that your primary repression is anger. No, because think about it, that emotion isn't as repressed. It's the sadness under that, the hurt that is buried that you can't access. And then your system goes, anger, that's safer. That's what I remember from the past. We can get angry here, but you're not conscious of that. In that moment, you just can't feel sadness, or you feel a shutdown on it. That's another thing. So you can learn from all of this. It's so rich. It's so, it's amazingly rich, guys. If you hear this, you learn from everything. So if you're a sadness repressor and you go to, I'm not hurt by them, and anger comes up, you know what that is from the beginning on the inside out path. That's your safer emotion. So you're not bamboozled by it and you don't have to bypass. You can process the anger just by saying, I'm not angry. Let it all come. It's okay to be angry. Let it all come. And then go back to the sadness repression. And always, 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 always go back to that. Always. Because if you keep going to anger, that's the bypass for many of you who repress sadness, right? I'll talk about that in a second. How that can just completely bamboozle the sadness repressors, anger can, and anxiety. Anger and anxiety can mislead a sadness repressor for decades. A lifetime, actually, more than decades. So whatever happens when you're working with, I'm not hurt by them, teaches us, is a pointer. Remember, everything's inside out. So here's what can happen when you get to, I'm not hurt by them. One is you might just start seeing thoughts that say, yes, I'm hurt. And you're awake to the mind-body connection. You're just there, stay there. Allow everything, allow every single thought. It's like a lost child. So the thought that says, I am hurt is valuable, so valuable to the hurt repressor. because the feeling of hurt is so valuable that they've repressed. So when if you finally see some thoughts that say I'm hurt, cherish those and welcome those and almost like keep them in awareness because it's thawing out the emotion slowly. I sat with the thought I'm angry a lot and it just thawed out my pain over time. Now, I developed third dimension work, which is a much, much faster, more effective way of doing that. But definitely get started here. It's very powerful. So some of you will just be able to see all these thoughts coming up that say that you're hurt and also that you can't express it. Because one of the inquiries is, I can show hurt, right? Many of you will see thoughts on that. There's nothing to do there other than let all that be. Allow all of it and keep going and keep bringing it up. The more you bring up the thought, I'm hurt and I can't express it, it's being acknowledged and made conscious in the mind, and you're witnessing it. You're not thinking it, you're seeing it every time. And then by bringing that into awareness, the emotion starts coming into awareness. It means it starts to thaw out. It might take weeks. Truthfully, you might sit at that repression inquiry many times during a trigger, but and it would help for sure. But you might not feel the hurt or sadness until weeks later when it starts to thaw out. That's another reason that we bypass is because if we happen to stumble upon the fact that a certain contraction is sadness repression, like in meditation or something, because it doesn't produce the sadness, we're bamboozled, right? We're fooled into thinking either that that's not sadness or that that's something else because our system is trying to keep us safe anyway. So it doesn't want to discover that. And that's the bamboozle. It wants to hide that. So many of you will see the mind body connection and that will start thawing out the emotion. Stay with that. But some of you will experience, again, it won't feel like sadness or hurt. So you might be fooled into anger or into shutdown or dissociation or some other landing point. This is what I should have done in the last video is take the time and bring the map up. Yeah. I talked to Chester after the video, not about the video, but when I talked to him and I just saw our relationship and the rich insights, I thought this subject needs more attention. Because right here, for example, in the trigger, you might notice again, if you're a sadness repressor, the safer emotions rather than the sadness might come up, anger or a dissociation or shutdown, right? So you say, I'm not hurt. And suddenly it's like you're numbed out, you're shut down. You might even be thinking something else, or like just turning away from it, or just frozen, can't feel, can't express. You might have a non-dual or a spiritual insight that comes up if you've been on the spiritual path. As soon as you say, I'm not hurt by them, your system might try to protect you and say, yeah, there's no hurt here. It's just presence, let everything be. Just stuff like that, which hides it. Just spiritual insights, which are coming up that are not really tied to your experience. They're more tied to staying safe. They're not really insights in that way. They're just repetition of old pointers or ideas that protect us in those moments from actually really feeling what we've stored in our bodies there. And then also like nervous system regulation techniques. So we're learning as trauma informed, we're becoming trauma informed. We might shut down around the sadness. And instead of learning and raising our skill to move through the repression, we just learn how to come back to homeostatic balance or something else that just doesn't get to the repression at all. And we're regulating our system instead of reversing the repression. So lots of things can happen when we get to that, what I call it's the repression barrier. It's a made up term. I mean, Ken Wilber created it, I think, with regard to shadows. But here, the barrier to me is energetic. It's all that is just the felt sense of no. Like, well, it's like, yes, I'm sad, but no, I can't feel it. I don't want to feel it. I'm scared. It's like a barrier. there's a mind-body connection on it. It's not just buried sadness. It's I'm sad. I can't. I'm afraid. So that's what shuts us down. That barrier is not really a barrier, right? It's repression. But when we get to that repression, that acts like a barrier, and we just get kicked out of it in so many different directions. We go anywhere but the sadness or hurt. And that's how our system is protecting ourselves, us. Again, we go to anger, we go somewhere else, dissociation, we numb out, we dissociate, we just keep coming from the mind. We go into deficiency story. That's another one. You guys, if there's nothing else that you take away from all of these videos, just take this away. That right there, the deficiency story is a safe landing point for us as traumatized, repressed people. It's a it's a safe, it's your identity from childhood that's coming in. It's keeping you safe from the sadness right there. So look for that. Like, especially when you start working at the repression barrier with KI, you'll be doing stuff like this. I'm not hurt. Yeah, I'm hurt. You're just resting with it. And you can tell that this is the right inquiry because your body's responding to it. But then it feels scary. So what comes up is like, I'm unlovable. And that's safer, see, because first of all, it's mind. It's the mind version of the lack, right? And so it's already removed from the sadness because it's mind and it's old identity, which protects you from the sadness anyway. So as soon as you're there, identified with that, you're protected from it. So what I say is spend a little bit of time processing the deficiency story, but come back to the sadness repression because that's what's creating that, right? And if you keep going to deficiency story, that's what I say is the big part of the what I call the great non-dual bypass, which is just an Eastern practice bypass. Actually, it's not just non-duality, is that we're processing identity as if it's disconnected from all of this. It's like the only metaphor that I give that makes some sense is if you're looking at a garden, it's like you're getting triggered. It's the roots under the ground that create those flowers and those weeds or whatever. So you just go and just get the flowers and the weeds and nothing underground. Therefore, it just keeps producing the deficiency story. And that represents over time a bypass because the roots, meaning the repression and trauma in the body, we now know can manifest as disease or chronic pain, even if you have a shift into presence. This is all that these are the teacher scandals, this teacher diseases, the teacher's getting sick. This is what's happening. Too much focus on identity as if identity is not connected directly to trauma and repression. And we know that trauma and repression is what's creating all the disease and stuff. So the bypass is spelled out for us. In my view, it's like right there. But if we keep going to identity, it's a safer place to go, especially during a trigger, we're going to miss the repression. So identity, deficiency story, you remember it's a pointer. When you see that, process that, of course, see it for what it is, even do inquiry with it, but come back to the root, which for sadness repressors is that fear of feeling, expressing those emotions. So here's the thing about Inside Out. In a very radical way, which you might not like at first, it pulls you back to the root of the suffering, no matter what's happening. And in this case, what's happening would be the trigger of some sort. You know, you're going back to the primary repression. I'm not hurt. You're getting shut down. Well, so the trigger itself is a pointer, right? I'm triggered. There's my deficiency story, points me back to the primary. But then when I'm working with the primary, if I shut down, that's a pointer. Now I have to work with the shutdown state. We do that in KI, especially third dimension. By working with the shutdown state, you don't have to shut down around that emotion. You can come back and work with the emotion. But if you shut down and don't learn, so whenever you shut down and can't go through the repression work, raise your skill level. For me, 100% it was a skill issue, is what that was. It was not understanding and being blind to what was happening and then not having the skill. So If you shut down, it's showing you, oh, I need some skill here. Otherwise, my system's just going to keep shutting me down around hurt. So everything is a call or an invitation to raise your skill level. You're being pointed back to the root of suffering every time. If you can't go there, raise skill. Another place you could go when you get to the hurt repression, obviously, is anger. That can come up quite naturally for a sadness repressor. But then see what that is? That takes us away from the primary. That's a pointer for sadness repressors. Your anger, unless you repress anger a lot, is a pointer back to the hurt underneath the anger, because the hurt is what's repressed. See that? But if you so here's the thing. Let me just say this. All of these things are pointers. So chronic pain, shadows, triggers, even depression, it's all pointing to the trauma. And now we have tools that we can work through it now. It points it back there and we're not just stuck with it, right? But you have to raise your skill level. The thing I want to say here, just to interject, is I'm going to branch off a little bit, because the theme that I'm sharing with you now is that how all forms of suffering, I'm going to come back to that. We've talked about how deficiency stories and triggers point to that. We've also talked about when you shut down, that actually points to raising your skill level for the repression. We've talked about anger coming up, that points you back to it. See how everything is pointing you back to it. It'll take a while to really sink into that direct experience, but it's so delicious, because then you can't bypass. It's literally impossible. You could, but you would have to leave KI probably to do it. Because I don't know how you'd be able to do that here. You literally have to just not listen to me and then do your own thing and suffer, and then come back and I would say no. And then you would just not listen to me again, and you would do something else and suffer. And then the suffering would be too much after a while, because you're activating the repression. When you use reverse inquiry, hey, you should know this. Whenever you're using reverse inquiry, even on something like a deficiency story, you're activating the repression. It's just like you're triggering yourself. So just like in a trigger, you're activating the repression mechanism each time, which is good because you want that. That's the root of suffering. But if you don't know how to skillfully move through it, you're just actually re-traumatizing yourself. What that's going to result in is you're going to leave KI if you don't have the skill, because you're not going to want to keep re-traumatizing yourself in a way that doesn't move through the trauma. So I'm going to come back to that all forms of suffering point to the root of suffering. And then in second and third dimension KI, we have tools to move through that now. But now let me branch off. I started to talk about this earlier. Yeah, I need to just bring more emotion into this, because that video was way too fast. The energy was off. I'm in love. I love this person very much. This is someone that I've been able to connect with on a level that I've never connected with a human being, Chester. And there's a lot of compassion here that I want to share, because he's not unlike a lot of you out there. So let me just talk about hurt or sadness repressors generally, but this is a lot of what Chester has gone through on this issue. Well, let me start by saying knowing is half the battle, right? So I see like anger repressors. So we anger repressors are just like sadness repressors, in that we'll go everywhere but the anger, when it's the anger that heals us. Processing the anger, not just being angry, but processing it, feeling it, and fully allowing it. And transforming out of the I can't, that ego mechanism, like seeing that being transmuted. But before we do that, we go everywhere else as anger repressors. We work a lot with sadness or hurt because it's safe, potentially. We might do a lot of work with self-limiting beliefs because that's safer. Deficiency stories. We might come into non-duality because, frankly, that's safer to deal with the ego than it is to deal with the repression. And then we might go to doctors and therapists. How many doctors have I gone to? How many medical devices did I buy to try to soothe my chronic pain? And it was anger. So, how much money I spent. In my view, the anger repression drove me to the non dual path, and I was blind to it. So, it was the driver of my suffering, a large driver. So, all those things that I did were driven by the repression, but I didn't know it. Going recovery, addiction, science says repression, especially anger repression, is behind addiction. I went through years of recovery, all kinds of addictions, not even knowing that that was going on. Cancer. I got cancer, did not know that I had anger repression, and then developed spinal stenosis and chronic pain, severe nerve pain. That was anger repression. And doctors everywhere but to the anger, almost everywhere else, the great bypass. And sadness, hurt repressors are no different. And I watch you guys, it's not just Chester, it's people that I've known through the years. I have a lot of compassion because, first of all, you're often misunderstood greatly. In fact, you might not even understand that you're misunderstood, strangely, because you might think that you have, for example, an anger issue. This was Chester's thing. He can get angry very easily because it just isn't safe to go to sadness. So that's his defense. And then the people around him at the receiving end of that, they're focused on that anger because he's been hiding from himself and others the hurt, just like I hid the anger. So I'm the quiet, peaceful one in a dispute. That's a lie. I was angry. And he shows up as the angry one. That's a lie. He's hurt. We're both hurt. We're all hurt, basically. How we respond to it is different. So in responding to life from anger, sadness repressor, you could be misunderstanding the issue and thinking I have an anger issue. But here's what I just joke around and say to sadness repressors: the inside out path is arming you with insight from the beginning. So even if you haven't reversed the repression of sadness, even if you're still getting angry, arm yourself with learning how to speak more clearly to yourself and others about what's going on. It's very hard. It's the most, it's so difficult. I have such compassion for anybody who can do it. Chester's been doing a lot of work. Let me explain what it's like for someone who hasn't reversed the hurt repression, but is becoming more aware of it and is being more vulnerable and honest. This is what it looks like. He's he's still in the process because of the stuff that went on for him. He just didn't have a chance to really go into the hurt or sadness, and he didn't understand it, that it was driving everything. But now that he understands it, he's so much more focused on that. And so in a dispute now where we used to get angry with each other because he couldn't go to hurt, what I'm watching him do is when he wants to attack me, he'll say, I'm hurt, I'm afraid. And sometimes even I can see his lip quivering. It's so beautiful because it's like, I already knew that. I know that about you. I know that the anger is a facade. But when he says it, it completely changes the course of the conversation. And it just opens us up to vulnerability. That was the holdout for us because I was coming out of anger repression. I was very interested in vulnerability for us, but I had to go to the anger first because I was repressing it. So this is why we got divorced. Ultimately, is that he was having difficulty. He was so angry, it became problematic, but it was his trauma. Well, had Chester not been interested in working on that, we probably would have stayed divorced. But he's been doing a ton of work, and that's what that looks like in a conflict. He knows that he still gets angry because he can't open to the hurt. He's processing it, but even before he processes it, he'll say, "Hold on, I'm hurt. I know I am." And then he might want to go back to the anger, right? Because it's just natural. But then just keeps opening to what's true for him. What's true and authentic is that he's afraid and hurt. So if you can start to do that and then step away and process, I think you'll put your anger on people less, and that will create less relational issues. And I think you'll get to the real issue, which is the hurt and sadness. And so that's the thing is I've watched so many sadness repressors. What I joke and say to them is like, if somebody says you have an anger issue, say, anger's not my problem. It's actually, unfortunately, it's my solution until I can open to the hurt and sadness. And I'm not saying that you say that in an angry way. I'm just saying you say it in an honest way. Like, yeah, I know it definitely looks like it's anger, but what it is, it's really hurt. And I'm processing that. But this anger is how I deal with it. That way you're not bamboozling yourself and others as much when you're saying stuff like that. And so that can also get you focused on the real issue instead of, I don't know how many of you have gone to recovery or spirituality or therapy or something, even anger management, when thinking that that's your issue, but your real issue is the hurt underneath. And then the other thing that also Chester dealt with, and I see a lot, is the anxiety disorders, or just anxiety, even if you're not diagnosed. There's lots of reasons for anxiety. It's like just thinking about the future, obviously. But a great deal of the anxiety for a hurt or sadness repressor would be the fear of being yourself. So even your deficiency story, when you feel anxious and you feel like I'm not good enough or something, think about it. It's because you can't be yourself. That's anxiety producing, that you actually have to show up in a false way because you can't open and feel this sadness or hurt. So you're storing it and you're showing up as a false self. So you can see how that would be anxiety producing. Like a lot of sadness repressors think that people are always thinking about them or judging them, or like they walk into a room and like, you know what I mean? It's because they're judging themselves. It's a false self that they're playing over and over again because they're afraid of the sadness. If you would go to the sadness, bring that repression into awareness, the deficient self and the anxiety, the fear. So that's not just like an anxiety around, I'm not good enough. There is a deep fear or a terror in the body of opening to sadness. So when you have a deep terror, like a hypocenter of an earthquake, it's going to create, the epicenter or the effects are, one of them is anxiety. And so that you guys have been chasing all this stuff and depression. How often have I seen this where then we hear about anger repression being under depression, but there's often, even though depression has feelings of malaise or sadness, that doesn't mean that you're sitting and allowing sadness. It could very well be that that energy is just stuck there because it's repressed. And so with depression, you'll often have a strong deficiency story, right? It's trauma. That's what it is. So again, you might think, oh, I have depression, so I go and get medication. Nothing wrong with that, actually. That might be exactly what you need is medication for a while. But if you don't get to the root of it, see, the medication doesn't get to the root of it. So what's the root of it? Are there feelings and emotions that haven't been met? And is one of them is the primary sadness? I've seen people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, like the other mental health issues, which are sort of a different level than anxiety and depression. And those folks just like a wild goose chase, doctor to doctor or therapist to therapist, getting help sometimes along the way. But and even though the research says this is trauma, people treat it like a diagnosable condition. Once you diagnose something, you remove it from your direct experience. It becomes a concept. So when you say borderline personality disorder or bipolar, it's like, what is that? It's like when somebody slapped on the definition of, or you have spinal stenosis. Oh, great, thanks. That just removed me from the fact that I repress anger even further. So, you have to, that's why I'm saying you guys have to be the authority. In the inside out path, you're the authority, not the teacher, not the therapist, not the doctor. We're supporting characters. You're the one that's going to learn and know your experience. So when somebody says, well, first of all, this wouldn't happen, you wouldn't go then to a therapist blindly and say, I have no idea why I'm depressed. That would not happen on this path. You probably go in and you say, well, here's what I know. I know that I repress sadness and hurt because this happened to me. And that's the one that I'm most afraid of. I also sometimes repress anger. I also notice there's shame around this, and the other. And I'm 100% no, I know that that's creating the depression. Is there anything that you can help me with? Because I'm processing that with KI, but in the process, I'm resistant to the process. And so I'm experiencing symptoms that I need to manage. Or can you help me manage? See, you're armed. That's going to be a completely different conversation than going in there and saying, I'm depressed, or I don't even know what's wrong with me or what I think is wrong with me. And it's going to be much more, it's going to be a real conversation in which your experience really, really matters because you're the authority. And then you're not bamboozled as much. That's why I'm bringing this part of it, that you're the authority for your experience. And then once you do the somatic testing and you see what your primary repression is, you carry that with you wherever you go. And therefore, not by bamboozling yourself. And then when you do reach out to people, even if you go to another spiritual teaching and you say, here's what's going on for me. If they say things like, oh, so you believe you're not good enough, that's just an identity coming and going in awareness. Thank you, but no thanks. That's not just coming and going. You're armed with information. No, that identity is connected to the fact that I can't open to hurt. See, therefore, you're just not bamboozled by them saying things like that that ignore trauma. You don't have to ignore it here. Okay, so now we're going to come back to all forms of suffering or pointers to the repression word. And I'm just going to run through these kind of quickly. But chronic pain and body contraction, we'll put them in a similar category because it's like an area of the body where you're storing primarily the hurt. Now, remembering though that in the course of a day, that doesn't feel like hurt or sadness. It feels like pain or contraction. So, right there, it's going to send you into a bunch of different directions that have nothing to do with what it is. It could be that you manage the pain, medication or something, or some spiritual or other technique that manages the discomfort of that, or even energy work, like, but that doesn't get to the trauma, that just energetically helps you. Qigong and other things can sort of get to that, but they really don't. A lot of the stuff is energy work, but it doesn't bring the unconscious mind into awareness. So repression will stay even during a lot of forms of energy work. So, for example, we have yoga instructors who become trained here because they understand that. They understand the value of yoga. They also understand that you have to actually reach into the unconscious with certain things. Otherwise, energy stays. Pain. So, the one thing I want you to remember is if you have, here's another thing, body contraction will send you seeking. If that energy is stored in a certain area, these contractions tend to be like the fuel or the engine for seeking because we're trying to get away from ultimately the sadness or whatever that is. But just remember, pain or contraction usually sends you in a direction completely different than where you need to go. And so that's going to correct that on the path by just doing the somatic testing video and realizing that, seeing in your direct experience that the pain in your shoulder or the stomach is the hurt from the past. And once you see that, then that changes everything because then you're not often running to soothe pain. I mean, you will be doing that too, because we have to manage things, but you're going to be going into the sadness repression, the hurt repression, because you know that's the root. You're going to develop a practice, a regular daily practice, if you have, because that's what gets to it, making that conscious. That's how I healed my chronic pain is by focusing just on the anger repression and no longer going, well, for me, I stopped going to doctors. I don't suggest that unless you really know that it's not life threatening and it's really anger or sadness. But I had to stop feeding my brain with information that was taking me away from repression. And I just focused on that. Um, okay, so there's pain and body contraction. Another two areas that we can put together are seeking and sabotage because they are similar. And somebody asked me what sabotage is, and that's another thing in that video. I just didn't define it well. But let me tell you what sabotage looks like. It doesn't look like sabotage. It's a funny topic because it's like I'll be in a session with somebody and you know, being empathic, as soon as somebody comes into my experience, especially after reversing repression, I can already see and feel kind of what's going on for them. If they're resistant, I could feel it immediately. And so if you guys are showing up with me in meetings, you're not going to be able to fool me. Even if you say something like, I'm going to be able to tell energetically where you're at with it, pretty much. I can't necessarily like know what the primary is for you every time, but I can tell when there's resistance and sabotage because of the way that you show up. This is something that you're going to want to get skilled at and understand really well. Because if you don't understand it and where it comes from, it just can totally take you out of trauma healing, or in this case, KI. Sabotage is more like this. I don't have time today for inquiry. I just have a lot of things. I have a lot of things I have to do. And then the next day comes, it's like, I really want to get back to the sadness repression, but I've got this, and the other, and I want to do this and that. So it's just a prioritizing from your nervous system that's happening automatically, that's finding ways to not go into the repression, but also in a way that you don't recognize that's what it is. It's trying to bamboozle you, keep you safe, right? So it's just safer to say, I don't have time today, than I don't want to feel and express sadness, which is the truth, actually, on the somatic level. So just so you know, so I put myself in the same boat. When I was just sort of all alone with this work, nobody else kind of knew about it. And I'm healing the pain, or the pain is getting healed. There were definitely times when I would say things like, well, I did it all the time, actually, especially if I got close to something scary. I would just say things like, I would find reasons not to sit and do it. Just whatever reason I could find. Oh, there's a new Netflix documentary. I could sit down here. I could actually sit here and open to the pain that has made me suicidal. Should be a really good use of my time. Or I could watch this new series on Netflix, which will be there every day forever. I could watch it any day, but I have to watch it right now. And so I would tell myself the real things I don't want to feel the anger. And by telling myself that I would rather do this or I don't have time for that, I create a habit. And any habit that you create for a while becomes your habit of just avoiding. So when you hear yourself, you might even journal. If I were you, to get under this, I would start journaling a little bit, especially if you're resistant to KI. And every time you say, okay, I want to go do inquiry, I want you just to write down what your mind is saying, the reasons. And so, like, let's say you have two reasons. I don't have time today. Um, and I don't know how. I'm not sure I'm skilled enough. Well, the second one is taken care of by learning the skill. So if it's resistance, though, it's not really that you don't have the skill, it's more of the first one. So most all of them are really just the first one. Well, let me be clear here. That's not clear. What I mean is the real reason is we don't want to feel and express that emotion. That's the real reason. But we say to ourselves, I don't have time. However, you have time to suffer, right? You have time to repress emotion constantly. Your relationships are devoted to it. Your job is probably devoted to it. You're spending pretty much every waking hour devoted to staying safe. So to say you don't have time, come on, call yourself out like I did myself, because that's really that you don't want to feel and express it. But if you start writing it down and then you say, I don't have time today, you can just sit in the inner body where you hold that energy and say, I don't get anything at all out of believing that I don't have time today. Like at the somatic level, I don't get anything at all. and you might feel something. And if you listen to it and even ask, like, what does this sensation really want to say here? You might hear like safe, like I don't, might like don't want to, safe. And if you listen, you might hear that. And then that's really what's driving that. But the utilities like that will stay often very unconscious, right? And so we just think then we don't have time. If you need more help on the sabotage, I did a video on sabotage not too far back on YouTube. It's probably where you want to go. But for now, journal. And it could be other reasons. And again, if it's a skill issue, if you write down, well, I don't have the skill, you have to be careful because see, you can raise the skill level. Like in the members area, we're just giving it all to you. I mean, you pay the monthly thing, but it's all there for you. See if really the skill issue is actually that you don't want to feel and express that. So I would just say, what do I get out of believing that I'm not skilled enough? Um, well, protect myself, stay safe. Again, pretty buried. But if you feel something, see, you shouldn't get anything out of it, really. It's just you don't have the skill. What would you get out of that? Oh, safety. See, but the skill issue is corrected so easily. You just learn the skills. Okay, there's sabotage. And often with sabotage, but also sometimes by itself, instead of, well, when we shut down around repression, for example, we might start seeking. I just heard somebody say that recently. She was like, I think I need to go find my true nature, get away from Scott for a second. There's going to be these teachers who were talking about where's my true nature. But she caught it and she recognized that the seeking for that was coming because she didn't want to feel and express that primary repression. So basically, the seeking, once she caught it, here's what I would suggest with the seeking when it comes up is boomerang that. So, who or what am I? What deficiency story arises here in this seeking for that? And then once you name it, you'll recognize this is an old identity. Go back to your VIPs, go to your primary repression. I'm not hurt. And then you'll see that same energy is this energy of seeking. It's pain, unprocessed emotion that's in your body creating this. I got to get away from this. I can't feel it. Seek, find my true nature. Now, the thing about it is we can recognize our true nature. And so the seeking is not a, it's, let me say this. We want to recognize our true nature, but it's already here. So the seeking is trying to take you away from here because of what's going on in your body. So we want to keep the true nature conversation involved, but seeking, we want to see that as the trauma coming up. Seeking is fine. We don't want to judge it. We just want to process it. We want to see where it's coming from. So what's so beautiful about this is that the seeking can actually lead us not only to the recognition of awareness, but to the embodiment of it. Because the seeking is being driven by the unprocessed stuff. That is amazing. And I want you guys to share with me what that's like for you when you really, instead of seeking, or when it comes up, you go straight to the repression, because I think you're embodying the realization, not just waking up to the presence that's already here, but the body that's keeping the score, that's running all the suffering, is being dealt with in that at the same time. It's a process because you're repressing and you have been since childhood. It's an everyday habit, right? So you're going to meet it each day and see it for what it is. Okay, we are drawing closer to the end, but I, again, don't want to rush. Make sure that I've covered everything so that you can come back here anytime and see where you're at with this, all this. I just smile thinking of all the people whose lives are going to be changed by this and what that's going to mean. Well, let me talk a little bit about sleeper repressions because with sadness or hurt repression, you might also find that you have to hold back happiness or joy, love too. Now, think about how commonsensical that is. Like if I'm a kid who I feel like I'm afraid to get hurt, but also I'm afraid to express the hurt or sadness of whatever is happening for me. Um, Hold on, let me rephrase that a little bit. Well, by sleeper, what I mean is it's like a repression that's hiding with or yeah, just hiding, and you don't even discover it really until you go deeper into a primary. So I went deep into anger repression and discovered, yeah, I'm fucking angry, but it's totally hidden in pain. But I'm angry at being bullied. And by being bullied, I had to stuff down the girl boy, girl boyishness of myself, that femininity repression. So that was a sleeper repression in that. And I discovered that. And along with that, I discovered some joy repression because I learned that in order, you have to repress the feminine, Scott, so that your part of your joy comes from that. So shove that down. So all of that makes up my primary repression: anger, femininity, joy, some love repression in that. There's my primary. And so my primary is made up with what I would say is like an obvious primary, anger, but then kind of some sleepers. And femininity was definitely a sleeper because I couldn't even reach that at all until I got to the primary because it was trauma and it was hidden. So now think about it with sadness or hurt repression. If you're a kid who you're in a family where it doesn't feel safe to open up to those vulnerable emotions, it probably doesn't feel safe to be loving and affectionate. And when I think of like Chester's household, his dad, kind of old school. So, you can get angry, but you're not lovey dovey and you don't cry, basically. So that gets pulled into it. Sometimes it's just not safe to open up. And so, therefore, love and affection is repressed. And I've seen people who are in chronic pain mainly just from love repression. So you have to watch out for sometimes these sleeper repressions are the whole thing for some of you. And you might miss it by thinking of only anger, fear, or sadness. You might miss that something else is there. The thing is, though, what I want you to remember is with any sleeper repression, if it's not an emotional repression, like femininity was a trait or a gender expression, but the emotional part of it was I was afraid to express that. See the emotional part. So if you have a sleeper repression like power, I have to hold my power back. That in and of itself doesn't speak directly to an emotion, but you may also be repressing anger because of the power of anger. See, all that sort of repressed. And then here, same love, hurt could be all together. How would you know that? Is you would do the Am I Repressing Emotion video on YouTube because I go through all those repressions, potential repressions. So just look for sleepers and think of primary as not necessarily one emotion, but several emotions or traits together. Okay. Now I want to talk about um, context. The- so what I do have an issue with saying everything's an illusion if that's believed, right? And then it becomes a belief rather than and then it's a bypass because we're not actually doing the work to see the emptiness of all things. Some of us, we're just saying that, right? It's all an illusion. People in the follow KI generally don't talk like that. But I want to bring in a context that kind of sounds like that, but it's more to help you with practice, which is as the evolutionary researchers are saying, and as we know from quantum physics, there's no objective reality. We're not seeing things the way that they are. We're not seeing the world. And the evolutionary researchers say what we're seeing, what we're adapting to see in evolution is only what we need to see to survive and procreate. In KI, those line up with certain utilities, right? Survive, stay safe, protect myself. That's what we see in inquiry around that survival. And procreation, roughly, is like get approval, love, bond with others, which could lead to procreation. Just remember this: the need to stay safe and get love or approval is a driver, major driver for all suffering. You could say that you're, let's call it a user interface. This is what Donald Hoffman calls it, or a headset. And this is where I'm asking you to hold this context lightly, not as a belief, but as a framework for inquiry. Something like space time or my experience is just a tool for visualizing how to survive and procreate. So, what I'm experiencing is just a helpful survival mechanism that helps me stay safe and get love. That's not reality. It's not how things really are. It's just what I need to see. So that you carry that with you. And so that's going to what that's about is not about believing that, it's about shaping our practice. So now, if I know that I'm not really seeing reality, I'm seeing what I need to see to stay safe and get love, then which which programming do I land? What do I believe more? What is really true and real for me? Because whatever's really true and real for me, that's where the Velcro is. Because it's not really true or real. It's that I believe it to stay safe and get love. So I want to look for those areas. And frankly, with sadness repressors, the thing that you really believe, or one of them that you believe is really true, is that you can't feel and express hurt or sadness. It's probably potentially the strongest belief system that you have because it's been keeping you safe. So if this is one of the strongest belief systems that we have, why aren't we getting to that first or at all in some cases? See the problem with that? We don't even know that it's a very strong belief system because it feels like reality. It's how we're surviving. It isn't until we start to make it conscious that we actually see what this is programming. And we're landing hard on that, right? Stay safe, get love by holding back myself, hurt, sadness. So if this is all true, that we're not seeing objective reality, we're only seeing what we need to see to survive. And how I'm surviving is by holding sadness back, then that's where I want to go. That's what I believe the most, or this that I'm really believing to stay safe and get love is that I have to hold that back. This was why on the inside out path, we want to go to the belief systems that really do matter, that are truly the root of suffering. And part of the bypassing is that, like, we miss that. And then a lot of suffering gets created from that. But the suffering is just like an extension of it. It's like if I can't feel and express hurt, then I might believe all of this stuff, whatever that is, spiritual, worldview, politics, story, and all of that protects me from the sadness. So in non-duality or Eastern practices, what we might do is get really busy questioning identity and beliefs that are like being produced by the repression. And these are belief systems that we're not holding them as strongly as we are the belief, I can't feel and express sadness. And in fact, those are the effects of it anyway. So by focusing on the effects, we again don't get to the root of programming. That's what we're doing here in KI. We're getting into that. Okay, I think this is the last topic. Did I mention that abandonment or something like that from childhood is often the case, but not just like being left in the proverbial police station, here's a baby putting on the steps, abandoned, but abandoned emotionally, even a breakup. So some of you are you're gonna recognize, yeah, it's hurt that I can't open to, but I don't know. I was never abandoned, but then it's like, oh, I had a relationship when I was 17 and like he broke my heart. And I don't think I grieved. I don't think I really felt that. Or like my mom died when I was 10, and I just don't remember processing that. And so now I've got a bunch of issues like addiction or something, and that's what it was, or part of it. Okay, last subject. Thank you for your patience, for just being here with me. I know this topic is really important to many of you. So, yeah, thank you. Um, Last topic is this relational dynamic. So, this is one of the really cool findings from KI, and I'm about to like build this out more, but I can't force it. But it's going to start happening, I think, is this dynamic between an anger repressor and a sadness repressor being drawn to each other. This is me and Chester, although I don't really have anger repression anymore. And he's working on his sadness repressor. That repression, that's probably why the relationship is working now. But at a time when it really didn't work very well with regard to some of these disputes that we were having, and for Chester and I, we would have long periods of just like joy and peace and love. It was great. And then, like, because of the trauma, when something would come up, the unprocessed stuff created issues. But, again, he's making all those changes now. And that's what I think people in those relationships really have to do. First, I think half the battle is knowing. So, knowing what you repress primarily is so helpful. And then, especially if you have a partner who's open to this kind of work where you all can know what each of you repress. So I want you to look for this first. It won't be everybody, but many of you are like an anger repressor in a relationship with a sadness repressor. And how did you get there? Think about it. As an anger repressor, your shadow is anger. So you repress it. You may be drawn to people who can express it because that's an aspect of you, like positive shadow. That can play into the attraction. So you find somebody attractive, you like who they are, how they show up. You see qualities that you really like, but at the unconscious level, there's a shadow trauma thing happening because you are suffering, right? And you probably believe in a deficiency story. So this could be like this energy of this person might be attractive because you're repressing. But it also, when the person shows anger, as an anger repressor, that can be a trigger, like a negative shadow trigger, because it's too close to your anger. So this is where the relationship can be, you know what I mean? There's a lot of relationships like that, up to toxicity. It just depends on how woke or awake people are to this pattern. But you can see the recipe for suffering. I'm an anger repressor. I'm drawn to the sadness repressor who can show more anger or bigger energy, but I'm also triggered by that. So that accounts for why we're getting in those. And just flip it. So if you're a sadness repressor, you might be drawn to the peaceful facade of the anger repressor because of your anger, for one, right? If you have that. Chester was drawn to the peace in me, part of which was anger repression, part of it was presence. He was drawn to that. It was like an ideal for him, like he wanted that. But in a dispute, when I was repressing anger, that triggered him. Here's how that worked, if I can just speak from his perspective. This is a sadness repressor who's in a relationship with an anger repressor. In a dispute, see, if I'm a sadness repressor, maybe I'm able to get angrier, like when I was a kid. And so that's how I got attention from mom and dad. But if I get angry with an anger repressor, I might not get that kind of attention. They might shut me out. So whereas dad, when I got angry, he's noticing me. It's working, right? I can't get sad, but the anger works. In the relationship, when I do the anger with the anger repressor, it doesn't work in the same way. And that person might shut down, or the anger repressor might go to sadness or hurt, which is a trigger. It's too close to my sadness or hurt. So it's like mutual shadows, mutual triggers, mutual attraction, part of which is coming from that trauma. What's the solution there? Is for both people to start doing the somatic work. But what the reality is usually one person is not interested. And so you're here. Either as an anger or sadness repressor doing this work, do it. Because I'll just share this before I go. I'm not the kind of person who tends to try to put the work on people close to me. You could hang out with me for a long time and I never even bring up what you're repressing or inquiry or anything. You wouldn't even know that I'm a non-dual teacher if you hung out with me in a relationship, unless we just having conversation. I'm talking about the work, of course, but I'm not the kind of person who's teaching people in close relationships. It comes up sometimes, but I've learned that that's just don't do that. Because, first of all, it's often coming from a shadow. So if I'm an anger repressor and I'm trying to get my partner to be more vulnerable, that's often just because I don't want to feel the anger. So I learned there were a couple of times when I put a little bit of pressure on Chester, like, I think you should open up to sadness or hurt, which is actually true because that's his primary. But that was coming from the fact that I don't want to feel my anger and you're making me feel it. So it's not even about you. I'm protecting myself when I do that. So that kind of teaching in the relationship, forget it. I stopped that. I didn't even do it much, but what I'm saying is that I just stuck with my issues of coming out of anger repression. And because I was cleaning up my side of the street, eventually he just came around without me pushing. Because when you clear your stuff up, it illuminates the issues in a relationship because you're not trauma bonding in the same way. So when you start showing up differently, your partner either has to like it's gonna like they're gonna crash or something's gonna change, but not through your force. You're not forcing it on them. And I think that's really what we're looking for is to give people the space to discover it for themselves. But if you're in a relationship with somebody who's just not going to open to that, that's different. You make those decisions for yourself. But bottom line, do your own work and just let the chips fall where they may, because we can't control other people anyway. And usually, when we're trying to get other people to do work, if we don't test into that, where that's coming from, it's often coming from the fear that we haven't processed around our own trauma and our primary repression. Like literally trying to change others is so that I don't have to feel something, which we've always known. But with KI, we know it. We know it more. We actually know exactly what it is. That if I'm an anger repressor, trying to get my sadness repressing partner to be more vulnerable, that's because I don't want to open to anger. I don't want to feel the anger. If I can just change him or her, I won't feel it. I won't have to deal with it. Stick to your own side. Thank you all. This actually feels right. The video, the length of the energy of it. I apologize for the little delay. We had like I put the video out and I took it down, but I'm going to leave this one up for a while on YouTube. I don't know. Here's the thing I want to leave you with. I don't know how much I want to do this work publicly. I'm giving you some really powerful inquiries. For example, in addition to the inquiries that I've given you, one inquiry that I suggest as a second dimension inquiry for sadness repressors to carry around with you, like a muse, is I'm not afraid to lose her. I'm not afraid to lose him. Um, that's a good one. So I'm putting those inquiries out, which is second dimension. So it's light enough not to be, you know, but I've also put some other inquiries out there, and I don't know how that's going to land on you out there. If I see that people are not, increasing their skill or they're using KI to bypass or seek, and it's because of the way that I'm sharing out on YouTube, I'll just take it down and I'll just invite you into the members area. I'm doing this publicly because I do want to share the work, and I don't think that people should have to come to the members area to start doing inquiry. But because of the nature of this work, when we're dealing with old repression and trauma, we do have to do it conscientiously. Because if you don't learn skill and we're already bypassing, you could actually use KI in a way that it doesn't work. And it can actually make you feel worse because of your lack of skill. I don't know how much I'm willing to just be out here publicly watching that happen. So let's just see what happens. But please share with me how the work is. And look, everybody is going to probably get to a place where you're going to want to go deeper into third dimension. That's definitely work that I'm not doing publicly. How would you know it's time for third dimension? Like as soon as you can, because remember, the stuff we find in third dimension is driving everything. So as soon as you can get in and learn it, it's really smart to come in and learn it quickly, I think. But if you get to a place where most of your responses are somatic, like if you say, I'm not afraid to lose him, and then what's really happening is you're just feeling it mostly as body, I would go into third dimension work because that's the repression and it loves to hide. It loves to hide in the face of all kinds of spiritual practices and inquiries. It just doesn't come up. And then, but the contraction remains in the body because first and second dimension practices don't get to it. That's my whole point. Not that I've seen. So third dimension is your answer after a certain while. And for that, I'm asking you to come to the members area, at least just a month, learn the tools, or a couple of months, learn the tools, and then leave if it's a financial issue and practice, find practice partners. But definitely don't sell yourself short on this path by ending with the second dimension because you have no idea, trust me, of the depth of the freedom that's going to come from really getting to the repression. Love you all. Thank you for listening and watching.